LCS Fantasy returns in early January. Get ready. That's right, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to be doing a Fantasy LCS series on my channel. Getting ready for the new Fantasy series coming out this January, obviously, when the spring split starts. And I'm going to be doing more videos down the line, especially once all of the rosters have been announced. Then we can really get into draft priority, pick priority. I'm a big fantasy player myself. I've played on fantasy services such as Riot's official one, obviously, as well as Alpha Draft and Vulcan. So I've played both styles. I've played the one where you draft a team at the beginning, and I've also played week to week. And it's all lots of fun. So in this episode, the first episode, before all the rosters are announced, we're just going to talk about general kind of ideas when it comes to Fantasy LCS. And the first idea we're going to talk about is what makes a fantasy pickup good. What makes a player to get good? And obviously, the answer is a player that scores a lot of points, but we have to know what those players are going to be. So, right, there's four main classes of players that I think about when I'm drafting my fantasy team. And the first one is a good player on a good team. These are no-brainers, right? People like Double Lift, right? You know, other players like Bjergsen, Rush, Huni, Piglet, Niels, etc. These are all players that are good players. We consider them good in their position, and they're also on good teams that are going to win the majority of their games, right? These are teams that play around the players we're talking about, that score lots of points, that do very well. And, you know, these are obviously good pickups. These should be the first priority when it comes to your draft. You know, your first, second, maybe even third and fourth picks, hopefully, will be these players, right? So examples of some players that can potentially be in this spot next split are people like Sneaky, Forgiven, GBM, Spirit. I expect those teams to all do pretty well. Forgiven, depending on, right now it seems up in the air whether or not he's going to actually stay on H2K, but assuming he does, I think he'll be a great pickup. The second class of player is bad players on bad teams, right? The exact opposite. So you pretty much never pick these guys, obviously. People like Dodo8, like Jesus Kas, Otter, Betsy from like last split. You know, these are like players that we don't consider to be very good at their positions. And they're on teams that are not going to win a whole lot of games, right? And so these players are pretty much players you'll never pick. There are some interesting and special cases where you might consider picking up one of these players for your fantasy draft, but for the majority of the time, you're not going to really even consider these. I'll probably do a video in the future talking about those specific cases and what really to look for. That's a lot harder. So, especially if you're newer to fantasy or you're newer to the professional league scene, especially, you never pick these players, obviously. Now, the next two classes of players are where the good fantasy players really separate themselves from the average ones, the just okay ones, right? The next two classes of players are just the inverses of those two, right? So good players on bad teams, right? These are players that we consider to be quite good in their positions, but are on teams that aren't doing very well. So, right, great examples of are players like Freeze from Copenhagen Wolves, Svenskeren on SK last split, Froggen, Elements, Sneaky when he was on Cloud9. He still is on Cloud9. Sneaky, Cloud9 last split when they had a lot of issues and weren't winning almost any of their games. Sneaky was still a great player. Forgiven, another one on Gambit when Gambit was doing poorly. Forgiven was also still a phenomenal player. And so these are the kinds of players that I think will bait the majority of people, or will bait the players, the people who are newer to fantasy, right? Because if we think about Forgiven and Freeze, right? Their stats were abysmal, right? They were the two lowest, AD carries. And there was the points overall. Maple Street confirmed better than both Forgiven and Freeze. What do you know? But, you know, these are the kind of people. For example, I played in a total of 4 different leagues in fantasy last split. 4 different LCS leagues on 2 different accounts. But in 2 of them, I actually had people draft Freeze into their teams because Freeze is a phenomenal player. People hype this guy up to say this guy's really good. And of course he performed abysmally because Copenhagen Wolves was never going to win any games, you know. Svenskeren was another great example of someone who picked someone up. Admittedly, at the time we didn't really know that SK was going to do that poorly. We expected them to do worse, but not nearly as badly as they did. But Svenskeren was a great example of a player, still a top-tier player, who you look at that player specifically and you think he's really good, you know what I mean? And when you see him in the roster, you're like, that guy's really good. But picking him actually was not that good. If we think of junglers for average points, he was 15. I think that's middle of the table. It's like lower middle of the table, which is unfortunate because we consider him to be. I still considered him last split to be like a top 3 jungler in Europe. Top 3 Western jungler, maybe even. He's a really, really phenomenal player, but his team just wasn't winning any games. And so these are the players that generally you should try to avoid actually drafting, right? Let someone else get them. Now, again, there are specific cases. You have to go on a case-by-case basis, especially if you're playing on Alpha Draft or Vulcan and you're going week to week. Then a player like Forgiven, for example, like Forgiven last split, I think there was a week where Gambit played like Copenhagen Wolves and like some other team. I think SK? That might be wrong, but they had a really easy week that week, and so in that situation, Forgiven is a great pickup. Forgiven scores points phenomenally when they win, and when they're put up against an easier sort of week that week, some easier teams, then that player is going to score a lot of points, right? Because we know that player is still good, and in the right situation, when they're set up to succeed, they will, right? So in that situation, you could draft them, but in Riot's official Fantasy LCS, you don't really want these players. Let someone else in your group pick them. And the last class of players is obviously bad players on good teams. These are generally your sleeper picks, right? So for last split, good examples of these were Lulex, Dyrus, Santorin. Xmithy, to an extent, has his problems. And these are players that are generally really good value picks. These are the players I generally tend to favor more towards, especially in long-form fantasy, such as Riot's Fantasy LCS. These are the players that I think will really reward you for this, because we think of like Lulex's stats. Lulex was about middle of the table. Santorin's stats were quite good. Xmithy's were actually amazing. That's actually not that much better than Santorin. Santorin's and Xmithy's are both very good, right? For junglers. Even though we don't consider them to be very strong players, right? A lot of people wouldn't consider Xmithy or Santorin even like top 3, like top 5 junglers in NA. Maybe top 5, but definitely not the best players in their position, right? People wouldn't say that about them. And so these are where you're going to get a lot of your value on picks, because a lot of people who follow the competitive league scene but don't have that bunch of a grasp on fantasy, right? The majority of fantasy players, especially people playing Fantasy LCS, right, in your group of friends, the majority of them are going to be league fans. They're not going to be fantasy sports fans, right? So the majority of these players probably won't get picked, at least not earlier in the draft. They'll probably get picked up as alts. I prefer to pick them up as starters, right, if I can't get good players on good teams or decent players on decent teams, right? I would prefer to get bad players on good teams as opposed to good players on bad teams, right? Because bad players on good teams are still going to get a lot of points, right? Because their teams are winning games. That's just kind of the way fantasy kind of works, right? When you're participating in team fights later in the game, you're going to get points, whether or not you are a good player, whether or not you're contributing to your team's success. So good examples of this kind of player next split right now seem to be like Conquan from NRG, Balls in Cloud9, Noxiac in Fnatic, right? These are players that people in your draft most likely probably won't go for because they're either A, unproven, or B, just kind of bad. A lot of people don't consider them to be great players, but they're on teams that I think should win a lot of games. So because of that, they will reward you. And obviously, again, there are, good players who are on decent teams. There are decent players who are on, like, kind of decent middling teams, right? There's all these in-between gray areas, but just in general, those are the 4 kind of things. Obviously, you always go for good players on good teams first, but then, as a general rule, I prefer to stick to bad players on good teams before I go for the sort of superstars of other, teams that aren't going to do very well. And that's generally kind of how you have to pick fantasy, right? Because it's not about having the best lineup; it's about scoring the most points. And so that's kind of one of the more interesting aspects of Fantasy LCS. It's a pretty simple concept. It is super base. But that's pretty much what makes fantasy pickups good, is they're on a good team that's going to win the majority of their games, right? They don't have to be a superstar. They just have to be on a team that's going to win a lot of their games. That's the most important thing when it comes to fantasy pickups. So, thank you so much for watching this video. Again, this series is going to continue. It's going to keep running. We're going to have a number of different videos on different general topics for fantasy. And then as soon as all of the rosters are actually announced for NA and EU LCS, I'll get really into the meat and potatoes of Fantasy LCS. I'll talk about pick order, draft order, priority, just based on my predictions, based on what I foresee to be in the future, and based on how I foresee teams to do. And we'll talk a lot more about that. But that does it for this video. Thanks so much for watching, and have a phenomenal day.